in the ring we see bursting, right? So let's just say this is time slowed down, but in real life this is 7 hertz, like a theta rhythm. So the idea here is that theta rhythm and head direction cells, although they seem very different, may be underlyingly very similar. Is it clear why that? Yes?
I kind of missed it. Did you say if angular velocity influences theta?
I said running speed
Just
influences
the
theta,
speed,
right.
not the...
So it's a different kind of velocity. Angular velocity is the velocity at which something is turning,
Yeah.
and speed is the velocity at which something is going in a line. So that's a difference between the two. In one case, the thing that controls the frequency is an angular velocity, a turning velocity. In the other case, the thing that controls it is a speed or a linear velocity. But they're both numbers. It's kind of that's kind of a formal difference. But in some sense, the circuit doesn't know whether the thing that's pushing it to oscillate is an angular velocity or a speed. From the circuit's perspective, it's kind of the same thing. Does that make sense? Yes.
I know theta depends on speed and velocity and direction of velocity.
Yes, that's right. And so we did get to that at the end. But so for now, we're just concentrating on speed for simplicity. But you're right about that, and that would have to be considered when we. Other questions?
You want us to know the circuitry?
Well, yeah. So this is important. So what's really important is this part of it, which is that we made this comparison between head direction cells and theta cells that are if they're both oscillations with frequencies that are controlled by a velocity. That's basically the similarity that they share. And it turns out that they share very interesting anatomical similarities as well, because as we have seen, there are head direction cells and theta cells sort of sprinkled throughout these areas like hippocampus and internal cortex where like place cells and grid cells, for example, are also found. So you see theta rhythm and head direction signals. You see both of these two kinds of oscillations up here in the hippocampus in these areas where the spatial neurons are found. Where do they come from? The answer is they kind of come from the same place. Head direction cells appear to be created and originated down in these brainstem areas like the dorsal tegmental nucleus of GLU, DTG, the lateral mammillary nucleus, LMN. And I guess I don't have the full names of those brain areas written out. So I will, I do actually. So in this case I do. In the brain mammillary bodies. I will be careful about, not including terminology that isn't present on the slide. So you don't have to worry about that yet.
With the theta cells as an oscillator, when the rat runs at a specific speed, wouldn't that imply certain cells would then be activated to burst, so that so only certain cells would burst, not every theta cell?
So you're asking whether there are theta cells that only burst when the rat's running at a certain speed
Yes.
and not at other speeds?
Yes.
So that's an interesting question, and according to this model, the answer to that would be no. Remember that what is it that, we've seen different examples of this in the data, but what is the main thing about a theta cell's behavior that changes with the rat's running speed?
It's bursting in different.
Right, not whether it bursts or not, but the frequency at which it does burst. And that simply can be accounted for by looking at this circuit and saying, okay, yeah, this cell is bursting at a certain frequency. If the rat runs faster, the arrow starts spinning faster and the frequency goes higher. But it's not that some other theta cell starts bursting instead of this one. It's that this cell is always bursting, but the rate at which it bursts changes with speed. Does that make sense?
Okay, so you could also say this with head direction cells as well, right?
That's right. Well, so in the case of head direction cells, different cells fire in different directions. So you could say that, but you wouldn't say that one set of head direction cells fires when the rat is turning its head quickly and another when the rat's head is turning slowly. What the speed is does not determine which cells fire. each cell encodes a phase of the oscillation, which in the head direction circuit is actually a directional heading, but in the theta rhythm is a moment of time at which the cell fires.
So what's the frequency of the head direction cells influenced by?
Well, so that the question is, what is the frequency of the head directions of the theta cells? Theta cells, did you say, or head direction cells?
No, head direction.
Oh,
Because theta cells speed in.
the answer to that question is basically this graph, where you have the frequency of the head direction cell bursting plotted on the y-axis. And what is the x-axis? Turning frequency of head rotating. So the frequency of head direction cell bursting is, they don't really burst so much as just fire when the rat faces in their preferred direction. But if the rat turns quickly through the direction the cell likes to fire and it goes, you could call that a burst. The thing that controls when a head direction cell fires is, or how frequently it fires, is how frequently the rat faces in its preferred direction. Right? So the frequency of head direction cell firing is equal to the frequency of the head rotation. The frequency of the oscillation in the head direction circuit, I should say, is equal to the frequency of head rotation. The frequency, the rate at which the bump is moving through the circuit is the rate at which the head is turning. In that case, and here the rate is like 7 hertz most of the time, but plus or minus a little bit depending on how fast the rat is running. Other questions? Yeah.
So is it like kind of the frequency of a single cell, a single head direction cell firing is just related to how much the rat is facing in that direction, but the frequency of the oscillation is equal to the angular momentum? Is that?
Yeah. So let me see if I can put a finer point on this. So frequency in the case of an oscillation is just how often does something occur. So, and remember, we have these different definitions of frequency. The firing rate of a cell, like how often, what is the rate of active potentials occurring, which we just count up the active potentials and say how many of them per second are there, versus the frequency of an oscillation or a regularly occurring signal. So in that second sense of frequency, it's clear what we mean when we talk about the frequency of a theta cell. It's the bursting. It's a little bit less clear because the head direction signal doesn't look like an oscillation when we see it because it's not regular. It's the rat's head turning behavior is not, the rat doesn't spin in a circle like this most of the time. It's not recurring regularly. But there is some average rate at which the rat visits a given direction of directional heading, and you could sort of think of that as the frequency of the bursting of the head direction cell if you wanted to, but it's not regular the way a theta oscillation is. Does that make sense? Sort of. Yes.
Can you go back to the head model?
Up.
Yeah, the oscillator. So,
That one?
so what's the difference between the arrow,
Mhm.
the vector, and
The bump.
the bumps?
I just put the arrow there as a sort of a helpful tool for seeing how the angle, the phase angle of the oscillation is changing with time. So remember that anytime we're talking about an oscillation, we're basically talking about a point going around a circle. And if you want to measure the point of a circle, at what point is this? If you want to measure the position of a point on a circle, you can basically use an angle to specify that. And when you see an arrow rotating like this, you can sort of intuitively grasp that there is an angle that is changing here. You know, the angle between the arrow and the horizontal, for example, is changing at a certain rate, and that's the frequency, the angular frequency.
And then was there one where the arrow was turning faster than the bumps?
Oh, that comes up later. You
Okay.
know, well, so that's where the grid cell stuff comes in, sure. But we'll get to that. So other questions? Okay, so the point of this graph is just to, or this diagram is just to point out that in addition to this functional similarity between theta cells and head direction cells, that they're both oscillators in some sense, that are with frequencies that depend on a velocity, there's this additional anatomical similarity, which is that theta rhythm and head direction signals both get up into the hippocampus and these memory areas we've been talking about via almost the same route. They're basically two different lanes of the same highway. They're parallel lanes of the same highway. They're right next to each other. They go up through the from the brainstem areas like dorsal and ventral tegmental nuclei pudum, through the mammillary bodies, the lateral and supramedial mammillary nuclei, and then up into the anterior thalamus and medial septum and on into the hippocampus. So it's tempting to believe that these are really very similar circuits, even though they generate signals that look different to us at first glance. When we think deeply about it, we see that these are both oscillations. They're modulated by velocity, and they're coming from the same part of the brain and going to the same part of the brain. So maybe they are functionally much more similar than they might appear to be if we just look at the autocorrelogram of a head direction cell versus a theta cell. They look like really different, right? But if you think deeply about what they're doing, you might infer that they're more similar than meets the eye. Then we started to get into these questions about what these oscillations, these theta oscillations in particular, might be for. Why are they there? Why does the rat brain, the hippocampal memory system, have this dominance of these rhythms? And so I use this question?
No.
Okay. I use this demonstration, and I don't know if my computer is gonna. I played this. Well, I won't do this, but so I played these two tones, and then I played them through the same speaker, so you could hear this and hear a beat oscillation. And we talked about how that comes about because the if you have two oscillations of slightly different frequency, the peaks can line up, but they can't stay lined up because they have different frequencies, so they move out of phase with each other. But then they move back in again because this is an oscillation, right? So you get this beat oscillation as the two waveforms move in and out of phase with each other, synchronize and desynchronize, if you want to call it that, and they constructively and deconstructively interfere so that they reinforce and cancel each other alternately. So we discussed how that might in fact be the way that grid cells, for example, are formed, because if a rat is running across a linear track, and for simplicity we're going to assume it's a constant velocity. We didn't have time to get into all the math of what changes when the velocity changes, but you imagine the rat is running at a fixed speed across this track. If a grid cell, what it does is it fires at evenly spaced intervals along the track. And a very simple way to create that kind of neural behavior is just to assume that the grid cell is getting input from two theta oscillators, one going at 7 hertz, for example, the other at 8, and it fires when their peaks align and not when their peaks are out of alignment. And what will the grid cell do? It will alternately fire and stop as the two inputs become synchronized and desynchronized over and over again. So this gave us our working hypothesis that we looked at in more detail through the rest of week 3 about how these spatially tuned neurons might actually do what they do and why they rhythmically burst at the theta frequency when they fire, because maybe this is essentially what's going on. Make sense? This is kind of a core concept that we build on for the rest of the time. And I also, in week 3, encouraged you to think about this neuron, the grid cell, and these neurons, the theta cells, as sort of belonging to two fundamentally different categories of neurons. And I liked to call these synchrony detectors and these rhythm generators. So these guys are generating rhythms. These guys are detecting synchronization among those rhythms. And the synchrony detectors generate these spatial signals, whereas the rhythm generators are essentially sort of velocity signals. They are encoding the speed of the animal. Yes?
How can the theta cell tell the difference between this synchronization that's created by the theta cells which are generating this burst frequency? Because like I can imagine that like you'll have, it seems like the synchronization made by theta cells going to the place cells and the synchronization made by theta cells going to grid cells are very much similar. So how could it tell the difference?
Why does a grid cell, well, are you asking about why is a place cell firing differently from a grid cell, or why does one place cell fire differently from another place